This latest charm campaign by the Chinese Communist Party to host political parties from around the world testifies again to the ambition of Beijing to assert greater Chinese influence. The message President Xi Jinping, concurrently General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, calls for those political parties to cast aside ideological differences and rally behind the Chinese banner of building a community of shared future for the mankind. For those who tend to examine the new realities in China through ideological lens, they have to be reminded that China has ceased to use ideology in undertaking its diplomacy in the wake of the Cultural Revolution in 1976. How do we look at the economic and cultural implications of Mr. Xi Jinping's appeal at the just concluded conference, the first of its kind in the host country? To take a closer look at the Beijing initiative that was released at the conclusion of the meeting, we are happy to be joined by Mr. Hua Lining, former Chinese ambassador to Iran and the Netherlands, and Professor James Ray from California State University, Sacramento. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Before we get started, let's look at this.
Working together towards a community with a shared future for mankind and a better world, the responsibility of political parties. That's the theme of the CPC in dialogue with World Political Parties high-level meeting. Xi Jinping said no matter how the international landscape may evolve or how strong China may become, it will never pursue hegemony, expansion, or look to extend its sphere of influence. He said China is willing to work with other political parties for world peace and global development and to uphold the international order.
面向未来，中国共产党
Over the next 5 years, we will provide opportunities for 15,000 personnel from the world's political parties to come to China for further exchanges. And we propose to institutionalize the Communist Party of China in dialogue with world political parties high-level meeting so it has extensive representation and is of significant international influence.
The dialogue is the first major multilateral diplomatic event hosted by China since October's 19th CPC National Congress. It's the first time the CPC has held such a high-level meeting, and it drew a significant number of the world party leaders.
Welcome to our dialogue discussion here, gentlemen. What do you think of the timing against which this major conference, a dialogue between CPC and political parties from around the world, you know, the landmark events of the 19th National Congress? But can you elaborate a little bit for our overseas viewers to have a better understanding?
I think it's just the background is most important. My background is 19th Party Congress of Chinese Communist Party. In this Congress, we had confirmed the party's political line and have a more new drives for the Chinese, more development.
You mean we gather more driving force behind the consensus that has been able to be built with Mr. Xi Jinping as the core leadership. But at the same time, we are hosting, the World Internet Conference just being concluded in Zhejiang, in eastern China. So what do you think of these two major events, and is their relationship with the dialogue between CPC and other political parties?
Well, I think it shows a confidence that state-to-state relations are not the only way of doing diplomacy and building trust around the world. And so I think there's more Chinese users of the internet than citizens of any other country. And so that's a dynamic situation. And then political parties are not typically agents of people-to-people exchange. So bringing political parties from around the world to this event, I think, shows China is trying to think creatively and doing kind of building a positive image about China's role in the world.
The Chinese Communist Party has been in contact with over 400 political parties from around the world since perhaps the end of the Cultural Revolution. And by the way, China no longer used ideology to take side in shaping its diplomacy in the new era. What do you think of this practical aspect of our foreign relationship?
Yes, I remember 6 years before, when I was the first year in the university, Eighth Congress of Chinese Communist Party was held in Beijing. That was the first time and the last time of Chinese Communist Party. The conference invited all the leaders of Communist Party in the world. And no more such conferences held. And after that, all the Chinese Party conferences was held just domestically, without presence of foreign communist parties. But this is the first time that after Chinese party conference, Chinese Communist Party invited more than 200 delegates from 100
200 delegations.
200 delegations from more than 100 political parties all over the world. I think this is the first time in the history of Chinese Communist Party.
But who are those delegates and who are those delegations? Are they from countries that have set up very friendly and constructive relationship with China only? What do you think of the size of these delegations?
Well, I think a lot of countries that have closer ties to China would be represented. I haven't seen a list produced of all the different countries that are represented and all the different political parties. But if indeed there are American representatives and European representatives, that would show a great legitimacy to this event. If they are only representatives of sort of Central Asian countries and post-communist countries, then it wouldn't be quite as dramatic.
Right. Perhaps Mr. Yuganov, head of the Russian Communist Party, may have shown up. I didn't follow closely, but what do you think of the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party from the perspective of an American observer? Because it seems we have been associated with Stalinism from the American perspective. You've been here for a long while. Are there any differences, or do you think there are more similarities between Stalinism? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, however, we have to come to terms with the bias and prejudice with which China is examined by the Western media in particular.
Well, I think from an American perspective is uncomfortable with the idea of one party representing the people in totality and not having the competitive back and forth and scrutinizing each other's party, as we see in the U.S., one party challenging the other, and the outcomes that come from that. And so I think in many countries would see the single party leading the way in development, and that has garnered a great deal of credibility inside the country, outside the country. I would say Japan, which the U.S. built its democracy, is essentially a one-party democracy.
With LDP being the longest-serving political force in that
likewise
country,
in Singapore.
So that they can amend the pacifist constitution more easily, right?
Well, it's a
That's
centralized
execution
system. I think a centralized political system led to the kind of East Asian economic development, and so I think that's what China situates itself in, that framework, and delivering the development leads back to us the Asian values argument that countries in East Asia may not need the political liberties that are found in the West, but produce economic growth. I think in the West is often a preference for the political liberties and then hoping for economic growth, but sometimes I think sacrificing that goal.
President Trump and his strategic advisors, such as Stephen Bannon, vowed to put America first. In that case, can China possibly build a community of a shared future with this largest economy and the sole superpower in the wake of the Cold War? Ambassador Huang.
I'm sure that this concept finally can be accepted by the world, because in the 20th century we had this Cold War, and we had two disastrous World War, and after the World War II we have a very bad Cold War. And the Cold War mentality still is dominating many of the minds of the world. But actually, after the 21st century, we entered a new era, the globalized world, and we have to have the new thinking. The new thinking, I think, is just the mentality of to build a community of the shared future of the humanity. We have common future, and we have a globalized world. We have to. I remember President Xi Jinping once said that the body of the human being is entered the 21st century, but the mind, the head, is still in the 20th century. It's the zero-sum game. And
you mean the mind is in 21st century? No, the body is in 21st century, but the mind is in the
20th century. So now this is the problem that I'm sure that the concept the Chinese has advocated is quite had the future that people will finally accept this shared future of the humanity.
Well, I'm afraid some of those skeptical viewers and observers might disagree with you. James, for example, most American policymakers are so reluctant to accept the idea that Mr. Xi Jinping says we should form a new type of major power relationship. Starting from the Obama administration, few in the United States would view the sole superpower as equal with China, a rising power. So they cannot accept the new type of major power relationship. How could they accept the community of shared future?
Well, I think it'll be difficult because the U.S. had a special relationship with the United Kingdom, and these kind of shared cultural values underpinned the political dominance of the post-war order. And now to have sort of a G2 partnership with two very different cultures, very different ideological backgrounds would be hard to imagine governing in that way. And so I think on the one hand we see China's initiatives like the Belt and Road are very appealing to many countries in the world, including the Europeans, because it's respecting sovereignty, it's not requiring military alliances, and it's just focusing on investment and infrastructure. The U.S. puts countries in a greater predicament because it enforces sort of the defensive alliance system, and in that sense I think perceives China's military rise as its challenge, but has ignored the economic rise of China. And I think that's where we see Donald Trump arguing there's the economic conflict, but in a sense the U.S. isn't really in a position to challenge China's, I think, economic rise, and is tolerant of China's economic rise, and in many ways welcomes it, but is focused on China's military potential rise as its strategic challenge, and then therefore puts so much of its economic and diplomatic pressure on the encirclement, essentially, of China from an Indo-Pacific regional perspective.
Well, President Xi Jinping has been able to put Belt and Road Initiative into the basket of, say, community of a shared future. Basically, they mean much the same, namely to be more inclusive. And this idea or discourse is very different from putting America first, right? Or the Cold War geopolitical framework of Yalta with the treaty alliance in much of East Asia, rejecting Russia, China, DPRK, so on and so forth. So in this way, what do you think of the chance for China to rally the rest of the world behind its banner?
After the Second World War, the world has used to different kinds of alliance. There used to be two alliances. The one alliance is led by the United States. The other is led by the former Soviet Union. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was only one alliance, that is NATO or European Union. And in the U.S. diplomacy, still the U.S. government is very, they emphasize their alliance with the like-minded countries like the European Union, like Japan, Australia, Canada. But I think this is the old mentality of the world. We must have something new. China is welcoming partnership with other countries rather than alliance. This is the importance of Chinese diplomacy and Chinese foreign policy.
Well, President Xi Jinping has good reasons to say that the body in 21st century, the soul and the mind in the last century. 20th century. However, what do you think of the uniqueness of faith, values, and political institutions? They may be lagging behind the economic expansion, and they have good reasons to lag behind. Do you think the Chinese leaders should also call for the improvement of one's religious belief, values? I mean, China is making progress, but what do you think of the definition of progress itself?
Well, I mean, in the 12 core principles that Xi Jinping has laid out includes things like the rule of law and democracy, and those have different connotations. But I think the rule of law is really where the progress will or will not be made, is having the state uphold standards of law and independent judiciary and ensure that the courts are faithfully executing the law. And these kind of reforms could happen under the guidance of the party. And then when you talked about the internet, the perhaps relaxing of control over some aspects of information, introduction of Facebook into China and so forth, I think those are areas that can be managed gradually to a destination of 2049, and we might see that improvement. In the U.S., I think there's, of course, skepticism and uncertainty about what the level of transparency will be in the future, but that's the moment we're observing, I guess.
What do you think of this assumption? Sharing the same or similar ideology won't prevent those political parties from going to war. If you look at our border clash with Vietnam, which was governed by the Vietnam Communist Party, we almost went to war with the Soviets during the Cold War, and the Stalinist party called themselves the Communist Party. Now we have mounting tensions with the DPRK, where you have the Korean Workers' Party. It's also somehow in the shadow of the so-called Communist Party of the Cold War, by Cold War definition. So, but with the parties that adopt different ideology, ironically, we remain pretty quiet. We have been able to build a constructive relationship with these political forces instead of opting for war. What do you think of, I mean, the pros and cons concerning ideological similarities and differences when it comes to the world order?
Well, I think as you laid out earlier, the ideological foreign policy of the 1950s and 60s that supported insurgencies in countries didn't benefit China. The very pragmatic post-1978 foreign policy that's state-to-state relations, accepts all types of governance, all types of ideologies, has been enormously successful for China. In fact, I would say America's maintained more of the ideological drive in many of its foreign policy that's sort of jeopardized its strategic interests. So I think there's little to fault in China's foreign policy behavior, and even in the 5,000 years of Chinese history, not an aggressive power. So China really upholds the principles of the UN, non-interference, non-intervention, respect for state sovereignty, and there's a lot of risk in intervening into other countries' affairs, even for humanitarian purposes, let alone selfish purposes. So I find little fault in China's outward foreign policy.
Yes, indeed, the Chinese government has adopted a foreign policy of no strings, particularly in the case of Africa. China has been urged to intervene politically, but China says no. What do you think of welcoming Aung San Suu Kyi, the laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize, at this major conference? She comes under fire for somehow cooperating with the military of Myanmar in cracking down on Rohingya, the minority group in Myanmar. Now, some of the critics called for removing the glow of a peaceful, Nobel Peace Prize from Aung San Suu Kyi. But China has built a very good working relationship with the National League of Democracy, the ruling party in Myanmar.
I think the Aung San Suu Kyi's case is the most typical example of China's non-interference into internal affairs of other countries. Myanmar is a very typical example. We remember when Aung San Suu Kyi was in opposition, he was welcomed by
she was invited by.
She was, yes, she was invited to many Western countries, and he was welcomed in many Western countries as a hero. Mm-hmm. But after she became the the president or semi-president of Myanmar, she dealt with the domestic issues, and her foreign policy doesn't suit the strategy of the United States and the Western countries. So she is no more welcome in the Western countries, especially after the ethnic problems in Myanmar. She's, as you said, she has been asked to take away her Nobel Prizes, and she was unwelcome by the many Western. So this is the case, but China remained neutral, and either in the period Aung San Suu Kyi was in the position, or in the position that he is governing the Myanmar. So I think this is a very typical example of China.
That's a very practical and consistent policy towards Myanmar. What do you think?
Well, to me, the naivete or idealism of human rights NGOs and activists that put her on a pedestal because of her stance against the military junta that governed, I think there's lots of Nobel Peace Prize winners that can fulfill that goal, but then if you become a politician and you try to govern a country, you have to be pragmatic and you have to make choices to include stability as one of your goals, and then you are going to lose the aspirational views of this kind of group. But that's, I think, the case with many Nobel Peace Prize winners who went on to govern. You know, everybody gets their hands dirty when you try to manage a society.
Part of his presentation for Mr. Xi Jinping is to emphasize that we will not export revolution. We will not export our Chinese model to the rest of the world. First of all, do we have a Chinese model? Secondly, why we are so clear and level-headed that it's not a good idea that our model could be copied elsewhere. And that's the one.
I prefer to say the Chinese way of building socialism rather than Chinese model, because China after revolution, after the China and China's liberation, many mistakes were made during the first 30 years. But after 30 years, China finally has found its way to build its socialism. Of course, socialism under the leadership of CPC is the historical choice of the history and the Chinese nation.
Excuse me, when you say we are building socialism with the Chinese characteristics, those from Europe and particularly from Scandinavian countries would seriously disagree. They say you have a far greater and more embarrassing income disparity than in most of the European countries, all right? As they have adopted the welfare policies, and the middle income class account for maybe 85 or 90% of the population in each individual European countries, their income gap is not as big as in China. But the essence of socialism, by definition, is equality, equal relationship. Men and women are treated as equals, but look at the percentage of women's political participation and the representations of women in all the political bodies in China. We are put to shame by Europeans, and even by our neighboring countries like Japan, South Korea, and developing countries in South Asia. In Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, you have so many brilliant women politicians. In our country, so what do you think of the definition of socialism? Yes, with Chinese characteristics, but can we still call it a socialism? By what definition, by what standard can we be called a socialist country?
I think under the leadership of Chinese Communist Party, tremendous changes have taken place in China, and the people have better life, have much more life expectation, much better transportation, much better living conditions. I think that this is the aspiration of the Chinese nation for 100 years, for the last century. So I think this has been the success of Chinese Communist Party that made the whole nation, more than 1 billion people, accept the way of building socialism, under the leadership of CPC.
But still, you fell short of mentioning a clear definition about socialism. What's your take on socialism?
Well, in my mind, the European welfare state or even the American very modest welfare state could not take care of 1.3 billion people, so it's an enormous task to expect. And then China moving from a true communist system to then a market economy and then trying to build socialism out of communism. I would still say it is nationwide affordable health care. It's affordable in state-run hospitals. The healthcare system, the education system is really quite extraordinary, I would say. The public education, almost everybody's literate in this nation of this size. And then, you know, building the different institutions to lift, you know, the pension is rising. You know, I think all these things are moving forward, and so I'm quite impressed about the ability to take care of this size of a country.
Our late senior leader Deng Xiaoping called for keeping a low profile in international affairs, in Chinese Taoguang Yanghui. But now China is coming under pressure of you know, allegedly asserting greater influence, and we are described as assertive in South China Sea. The word assertiveness is a very bad word, negative in many ways. Today we are hosting so many multilateral meetings here in the host country. It's what we call the home diplomacy. Each year, without exceptions, we have this kind of, that kind of home diplomacy. Does it mean China is taking itself as the center stage already, the center of the universe already? We used to be called the Central Kingdom.
Right.
We don't like this idea, of course. China doesn't agree. But you can't prevent overseas observers, particularly those skeptical viewers, from thinking this way. They are still obsessed by the history, bitter memories about China's history.
Well, I think if China is able to build its own indigenous aircraft carriers and project power overseas and has now a base in Djibouti, that raises some alarm bells. But truly, you know, Russia interferes in its neighboring countries. India has interfered in the past, its neighboring countries. So China, with its historical claim to the South China Sea, I think should be seen in the light of it. It really has no interference in other countries. It's claiming this historical jurisdiction. It's not confronted by a navy. It's not confronting the U.S. sort of off the coast of Hawaii or San Diego. It's being confronted by the U.S. Navy right here off the coast of China. So I think if the tables were turned and China's submarines and spy planes were in the airspace and in the international waters off the coast of America, we'd have a different view about the rise of China. So I think any little step claiming Huang Yandao or so forth is seen as assertiveness, but I think it's a little bit...
Eventually, we have to face the issue of how to build the soft power, how to make China look more attractive so that it will follow your appeal, your advocacy. What do you think of the challenges lying ahead?
Unfortunately, I would like to say that Chinese software is far from being a very strong nation in the world, because China still is not a nation recognized as respected and admired country as other big powers has been. So still China has a long way to go to that top of soft power.
Perhaps the image of China gets more popular in underdeveloped countries, like in Africa. Look at the success of Confucius Institutes. In most cases, in developing countries, they are pretty successful. Well, we have a lot more questions to discuss about the image of China and particularly its soft power in the 21st century. I promise to keep the door open for this discussion. Until next time, goodbye.